You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have John O'Connor. He's the founder of a company called Gene Food, and the website is mygenefood.com. So, John, thank you for coming. How you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so what's the premise of Gene Food? What's the idea for the company?
The idea behind Gene Food is sort of bioindividuality, which is the idea that people, both in terms of nutrition and medicine, respond differently to different inputs. So there's a lot of debate out there in nutrition circles about, like, what's the perfect diet for, someone to be eating. Should you go paleo? Should you go vegan? And there's strong proponents on all sides. And many of these diets have a lot of principles associated with them that are sort of overarchingly healthy. But we believe that the genetic differences between us give us the sort of the code, the answers to the test in terms of what diet a certain individual is going to perform best on. And so we've created an algorithm that can parse genetic data and assign people into one of 20 foundational diet categories. And that's the idea.
I was going to ask you how many categories there are. So can you describe some of the categories and what's the differentiating elements between them?
Yeah, so we have, for example, like one of the diet categories is Okinawan. And Okinawan is a plant-based diet. The inspiration behind the diet is this community in Japan that's part of what's called the Blue Zone. Some of your listeners may be familiar with the idea of a blue zone. It's basically a region of the world, or in some, there's a blue zone in Loma Linda, California as well. But people in these regions live to be 100 years old at a much greater rate than the rest of the world. And so a blue zone is a region that's marked by longevity, and there's certain things we can study with how these people carry on their lives. And one of our diets is named after the Okinawan region, which is a sort of one of the best known blue zones. And it's basically a plant-based diet that's centered around, starchy, non-processed carbs, maybe small amounts of fish, a little more liberal with the glycemic load, like the blood sugar load of the food that these people are eating. And the idea is that the people that we put into the Okinawan category are probably the people who are going to have a reduced ability to deal well with a high-fat diet. So they're the people that are probably not going to be as well equipped to deal with like a ketogenic diet, for example, which is something that I know that you've spoken a decent amount lately about on your podcast. And there are specific genetic markers you can look at to give an idea. It doesn't always come out this way. I mean, genetics is not the whole story. There's a topic known as epigenetics, which is also important, which is essentially your lifestyle, what kind of medications you've been taking, et cetera. But there are these markers you can look at, like PCSK9 is one of them. PCSK9 is a gene that's associated with basically breaking down the body's ability to clear LDL, lipoproteins. And for people that carry the majority variant of this gene, their ability to clear LDL is reduced. And we've seen in studies that people that have variants in this gene, their ability to clear LDL is increased, and they generally suffer from a lot less heart disease. So,
well, all right, I understand that people are different metabolically, epigenetically, etc. So how do you silo people? So someone comes to you and they say, "Hey, I want to be healthier and eat better for my particular phenotype or my genetics." What procedure do they go through, and then how do you silo them?
Well, right now we're using raw genetic data from 23andMe and Ancestry. So we're taking, there's about 20 million people that have that data, and so there's 66 markers, 66, they're called SNPs, within those files that we can look at. And PCSK9 is just one of them. It's just one that is one that your listeners may have heard of, but we look at others. ApoE4 is one that we look at.
Can you talk about ApoE4 for just a brief minute, because it's recently become such an important marker to look for. So talk about maybe what it is and the consequences of why it's important.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of controversy surrounding ApoE4, but our opinion is that, well, first of all, people that may have heard of ApoE4, because people that carry one or two copies of this genetic variant in the ApoE gene are at an increased risk for developing dementia and Alzheimer's. And the nutritional implications of that polymorphism are basically that there seems to be an inflammatory response in carriers of that SNP when eating a diet that's higher in fat. So from 10,000 feet, people that are ApoE4 carriers are probably going to want to be a little more cautious with the types of fats that they eat, and at a minimum move their dietary intake of fat more towards some of the healthier omega-3 polyunsaturated fats, as opposed to just straight high intake of fatty beef, coconut product, etc. So, but having said that, we don't want to hyper focus on any one SNP. We have a medley of SNPs that we look at for these fat categories. But I
didn't want to go too deep into it. Just like a quick overview of why it's important and why it's in people's minds lately. So you did that. That's good. So all right. So someone will get their genetic data from 23andMe or other sources. Then you'll take the data and you're looking for these SNPs. So again, what's your process from there?
So the three basic top level ways we're looking at these genes is protein metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism, and then fat metabolism. And by breaking down the response to each of those inputs, like one of the ones we look at that's probably a little bit less common is histamine. So certain markers in the histamine genes will put you in a different protein category than some others. But it's 66 markers, and the macros, the macronutrient inputs are the big dividers, without getting into the weeds of the mechanism of these individual SNPs.
Okay, so and then once you identify the SNPs that someone has, how do you customize the diet? Do you tell them what to eat and what to avoid, and how far do you take it? What kind of recommendations?
Right. Yeah. So we mentioned the Okinawan, so that's going to be more of a plant-based diet. But there's paleo. There's diets that are more paleo. I mean, there's diets. We have a diet type called mosaic, which is for people that have stronger fat metabolism that don't carry some of these markers that we just talked about. We'll put them on a diet in terms of macronutrient recommendations that's closer to 35-40% fat. Somebody that's in the Okinawan category is going to be down closer to 10. And then what we're launching in our version 2 is we're launching a recipe database that is geared towards each diet type. So once you have your diet type signed, you can then go to the site, and there will be recipes that will be created that are in keeping with the macro ratios that we've given you in your report. So the report gives you overall macronutrient breakdown, foods to avoid, staple foods, tips for preparing food in terms of certain foods that are high glycemic can be made a little more tolerable by certain preparation methods. So we get into the top level macros, but into some of the weeds of how best to go about approaching food with this information as well.
So any examples, case studies of people and what changes they made or were suggested and what happened to them?
We just launched the product like 3 months ago, so we don't have any case studies at at this particular point. We do speak with a lot of customers, and and are privy to some of their biomarkers that maybe some other companies might not be, but that they've shared with us. But I think we're a little too early in the game for case studies at this point.
Well, what kind of generic feedback are you getting? I know this is just anecdotal, but anything that surprises you? Like, what are you hearing?
I mean, some of the things that surprise me are the responses that people have to the histamine genes. So when we see people and we've put them in a low histamine grouping, it always surprises me just how, to this point, how accurate that's been in terms of how they're dealing with allergy, food sensitivity issues with histamine and food, but also food sensitivities that can vary by location. So just anecdotally, we've heard from people who are customers who've said, look, I came back in one of these low histamine diet types, and I've noticed that I have food sensitivities in Dayton, Ohio that I don't have when I'm in Asheville. And, the rationale behind that would be that these are people who do a poor job of clearing histamine because they have lower levels of this enzyme called diamine oxidase, which is genetic. It's coded for the AOC1 gene. And so therefore, if they're in an environment where they have really, really nasty seasonal allergies, their body's producing a lot of histamine. Any additional histamine that's added to that bucket by food is going to become reactive over time. And then they move to a location where they don't have that same immune system stimulation in their environment, and they have much more tolerance for food. And that's a theory that's certainly new, but it is supported by some papers that have been written on histamine intolerance that have appeared in like the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, as well as by the clinicians that are out there. There's a doctor, Janice Joneha, who's spoken quite a bit about that in her writings. And so it's been kind of interesting to talk to people who have had those experiences, and we can see that in their genetics.
So if you're in a stressed state, if you're very sensitive to, if you have a high histamine response, that kind of throws off how your diet affects you, and perhaps it can cause certain foods that would be okay to not be okay. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's the histamine intolerance world and the genes that are associated with some of these immune issues like IL-8, IL-6. It's not all traditional food allergy. Like you have you have like a peanut allergy. It's this cumulative process where you have a few different factors that are adding to this histamine pool, and and one of them can throw the whole system way out of whack, is the best way I can describe it. I think food only becomes an issue, or food usually becomes an issue in those situations when there's been some kind of an insult to the gut microbiome. I mean, there's a whole host of reasons why you could have an excess of histamine. You could have the putrefaction of certain proteins that you can't digest that's feeding bacteria that are producing histamine. It could go in the reverse with certain carbohydrate sources that you can't digest that are producing histamine. You could have issues with mold that are putting the immune system on high alert, and histamine then becomes just one more thing that can't be handled after the system's been overwhelmed. So with these types of issues, it's tough to identify one sort of glaring food allergy that you can exclude. It's really this multifactorial thing.
All right, so you'll suggest, so you'll give people their results. I mean, and then what do you do from there? Are you making suggestions, or are you actually providing meals? Like, where do you want to take this? Is it just recommendations, or what's like the full experience going to look like?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the full experience over time, we get really just flooded with so many. We produce a lot of blog content, and we've had a good response to the blog thus far in terms of just engagement, people contacting us, readership, and I think that we do get so many questions that I think that the ultimate move will be some sort of a small health coaching program as well that we're going to pair with this. So for the people who are really interested in working with our team, you get the recommendations, you have the recipe bank. We're giving people the biomarkers that we would consider, that we think they might want to consider discussing with their physician. And then on top of that, I think there's a role there for some kind of health advocacy to kind of help people through the process of changing habits, building a lifestyle that can be that's well suited to their to their individual situation.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you. What is the service going to look like 6 months or a year from now? Is that the vision, or what's your vision now that you're getting all this feedback?
Well, I think 6 months to a year from now, we're going to roll out additional points of analysis genetically. One of the things we want to look at is sterol absorption, which I think is really relevant to the conversations that are happening with the carnivore diet. So we can touch on that if you'd like. That's definitely an interesting place for people to look genetically. I know the
carnivore diet is like new and hot. So what's your experience with that?
Well, I haven't tried the carnivore diet. I don't think that I would be well suited, genetically to the carnivore diet myself. But having said that, I have a great deal of sympathy for people who have food sensitivities. I think that the cool thing about what we do is we're not trying to debunk anybody. We're not here to say this diet's right or this diet's wrong. I think that there's diets that can be right for every individual. And the people that are reporting success on the carnivore diet, if that's working for them, that's great. I think the genetic explanation behind why the carnivore diet may be successful for some people is a rare condition called cytosterolemia, which is characterized by changes in the ABC and ABCG8 and ABCG5 genes. And the role of those genes is to kick out of the gut wall plant sterol. So like you have cholesterol, which is animal fat, and then you have plant sterol, which is plant fat. And generally speaking, we don't absorb the plant sterol. It's almost like the gut is like a bouncer at a bar. It kicks it out. It's temporarily absorbed into the wall of the gut, and then it's kicked back out. But in some people, they hyperabsorb these plant sterols, and so you'll look at a normal blood work would have like cytosterol levels, which are the fats in oats and avocado and vegetable oil, might be like 2 milligrams per deciliter. But somebody with cytosterolemia, they might be at 10 or 15 or 20. And what happens is when they've absorbed this sterol, it tends to affect their joint health. These fatty deposits will form and attach to tendons and ligaments, and some of these people have terrible debilitating joint pain. Well, that's the exact issue that a lot of the most famous advocates of the carnivore diet, like the Bell brothers, who are the power lifters in LA, or Michaela Peterson, who's the daughter of Jordan Peterson, the Canadian intellectual, they've complained about just being ravaged by joint pain. And so one of the things that we think is a possible explanation is like, why would somebody have sensitivity to all plants? What's the possible reasoning behind that? You could say lectin, but there's not a lot of lectin in green leafy vegetables. And so we think that a possible explanation is heavy mutations in the ABCG8 genes and a possible underdiagnosed cytosterolemia, because nobody really has access to these blood panels that measure the levels of sterol in the blood. And so even just for the casual observer, if you're doing a gene food panel, one of the things that we can steer you on is like, is avocado healthy for you? Is vegetable oil healthy for you? I mean, it's healthy for you in theory, but if you're hyper-absorbing plant sterol, it might not be as healthy for you. So, that in a nutshell is sort of, is our mission statement. But so we're launching that as a metric. We have some other metrics we're excited about. And then, down the line, I think health coaching, and, that might be in the next year. It's going to be a very edited program, but some health coaching I think would be valuable for our.
So how much of an effect have you seen because of dietary interventions informed by your genes, like personally, and again, anecdotally from other people? If you don't have much yet, you must have tested this on yourself quite a bit, or friends.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my whole team kind of eats, breathes, and sleeps this stuff. I mean, we're pretty big nerds, as you could probably already tell from this interview. But for me, the big ones have been the histamine genes. I mean, I've had experiences living in cities where it's unbelievable how much of an impact just my physical environment can have on what's happening to me with food in terms of how I react to food. And So those are big for me in terms of just keeping an eye on the freshness of what I'm eating. Steering away from, for example, going out. I don't drink a ton, but if I'm going out socially and drinking, I'm gonna choose gin or vodka or scotch, 100 times before I choose red wine once, and that's because those liquors are, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily healthy, but they're a little lower in histamine than red wine or beer. And a lot of people have a lot of trouble with histamine. They don't even know it. Also, just the way I approach dietary fat, I do a ton of. I've become very interested in lipids and lipidology, and I think that there's a lot of value for me in understanding, the interplay between Lp(a), which is a special subclass of like ApoB lipoprotein, which is just basically, to put it plainly, kind of a dangerous, a particularly dangerous type of, bad cholesterol, lipoprotein.
Right.
And you can see in these genetic panels it's a genetic marker that you can look at. You can see the LPA gene, and there's a family of genes. And for me, I've noticed after seeing it in my genetics that I also have slightly elevated Lp(a), in my lab, and I've written about the implications of that on the blog. And so, if you have elevated Lp(a), you need to be especially vigilant with this whole plant sterol issue, because these oxidized plant fats, they bind preferentially to these bad LDL particles, and it's the combination of the absorption and the oxidation of the sterol binding to these markers like these lipoprotein A that is the risk factor for heart disease, right? So me knowing that I'm absorbing a little more sterol, not to the cytosterolemia level, but me knowing that I'm absorbing a little more sterol, and then me also knowing that I have Lp(a), which is basically like the catcher's mitt that's sitting there to catch these oxidized phospholipids. Boom, that combination right there. I don't eat a lot of nuts. I don't eat a lot of seeds. I don't eat vegetable oil.
Can you feel a difference because of your interventions or no?
Yeah, I mean, where I feel the biggest difference, the thing that I'm, some of the biohacking community, you get these guys who are just like badass weightlifters. They're trying to bench like 300 pounds, and that's awesome. For me, what I want is really, I want consistent mood and energy. And absolutely, I find that when I'm dialed in on what I'm eating and I'm paying attention to these rules that I've created for myself, that my mood, my energy, my sleep, just my quality of life is definitely enhanced. And furthermore, I'm lucky to be in a position to do a lot of lab testing, so my labs look a lot better too. When I'm dialed into what I know I need to do for my own body, the benefits of that appear not only in my, these other areas, but also in the biomarkers.
And then with the histamine response, I'm just curious, have you identified symptoms that are obvious and non-obvious where people could tell, ooh, I'm having a histamine response to what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to throw out, one of the things that we want to discourage is this whole sort of like obsession with this reductionist sort of like, okay, we have this one issue, it's histamine or it's saturated fat or whatever, but because I think that a lot of these things work in concert. But I think a big unrecognized cause of stress and sort of a lack of focus that seems to be really systemic in our society are these food and histamine issues for a lot of people. I find that I'm just much more focused, much more dialed in, feel less stress when I have this histamine issue under control than when I don't. And because of the fact that we have this rise in environmental toxicity, which is also triggering the immune system, I think that these modern day issues sort of act in tandem and in concert. So you can have, air pollution, mold toxicity, et cetera, sort of putting an extra burden on people in their lives. And then you combine that with some of these histamine issues. And I think that that's sort of like the perfect storm for some of the stuff that comes up pretty regularly for a lot of people.
Yeah, it makes
in terms of
sense.
Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, what's the best way for people to get in touch and to talk to you and and try out the program and everything?
So the website is at mygenefood.com. It's www.mygenefood.com. And if they want to get in touch, a contact form through the site is probably the best way. Send us an email. We're on Instagram, but yeah, it's through the website. So.
All right, that's great. Well, John, I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.